want you to write the 5 major events we talked about in the flood. If you can. And hint, there's one per chapter, 1 through 5. Before the flood, and then the last one is write down the 5 major events of the flood. I said 5. You could consolidate it to 4, and it would be just fine too. Told me, and it said that there's 6 in the flood. According to the book, there's 6. But that's not the way I presented it. There's 17 Bible time period. Hey, this is just for you. If you want to write B, T, F before the flood, that's just fine too. You don't have to write it all out. Spelling doesn't count either. Spelling don't count. You're off the hook. Now, this is just for you to know where you are, because when we're in a group like this, if I start going together, if you hesitate a split second and you hear somebody else start the word, then you can jump in. It's not the same as you just pulling it out, the rabbit out of your hat. Still seeing some people writing, and that's fine. Some of you have looks of confidence and some of skepticism. I typed up a nice and neat little half sheet of paper with all the blanks out, and I walked off and left it at the house. So that's why you got stuck with a blank sheet of paper. Quit cheating. All right, everybody about done? Getting close? No, okay. I'll wait. I can be patient. Saw some head shakes. All right, I think we're close enough for that. So, I'm not even going to ask for feedback as far as how you did. That's between you and your sheet of paper. Hopefully, you got most of them. Hopefully, you got all of them. But see where you are, and if you need to still work on it some more, continue to work on it. We're going to keep reviewing it in here, and so knowing them will be helpful to understanding how we're going through this cycle. That's reverse order. Hold on. There we go. So that's reverse order that we did last on Sunday. So if you've got them, you can double check your work, but that's backwards. So before the flood, scattering of the people, the patriarchs, the Exodus, wandering in the wilderness, invasion and conquest, and judges. So right column upside down, and then United Kingdom, divided kingdom, Judah alone, Judah in captivity, return from captivity, years of silence, life of Christ, early church, and letters to the Christians. Hopefully you did pretty well with that. Now, like I've said multiple times, if you don't have it all now, we're coming back. We'll say it again. We'll give you some more repetitions with it. Now, with the time period before the flood, the 5 major events, you think about those chapter breaks, right? Chapter 1, what is it? Creation. Chapter 2, Adam and Eve in the garden. Chapter 3, first sin. Chapter 4, Cain and Abel. And then chapter 5, generations. So it lays out real nice and neat. All right? Hopefully you did pretty well with that. Not, we'll be back there in about 2.5 months, and we'll talk about it again. All right? And then the flood. You have the preparation for the flood. Chapter 7 and 8 is the flood itself. I think that the way Zach talked about it is the flood, and then the waters recede was 7 and 8 specifically. And then chapter 9, the events immediately after the flood. And then chapter 10 that we're going to talk about tonight is generations. Crawford? That we did talk about that. I think it was in 6, because that was the sin in verses 1 through 4 that were referenced, because there are 2 sins referenced in chapter 6, 1 through 4. No, that not the way that we were going to divide it up for the narrative. The book, if you're using the little book, it divides it up a little bit differently. The way that I divide it up is actually the way that Brother Waldron taught it in his classes, so I was typing it out from memory. So the book's a little bit different than the way he presented it, but the point of the matter is you learn the story, that you get the idea, and you know the events, and you know what the Bible's talking about. So now that we've gotten that off the screen, let's say the time periods a couple times together, and so hopefully knock some rust off. So, before the flood, scattering of the people, the patriarchs, Exodus, wandering in the wilderness, invasion and conquest, judges, united kingdom, divided kingdom, Judah alone, Judah in captivity, return from captivity, years of silence, life of Christ, early church, and letters to the Christians. So one more time. I think we're getting there, slowly but surely. Before the flood, scattering of the people, the patriarchs, Exodus, wandering in the wilderness, invasion and conquest, judges, united kingdom, divided kingdom, Judah alone, Judah in captivity, return from captivity, years of silence, life of Christ, early church, and letters to the Christians. Hopefully that's getting a little bit easier as we're going through this. So we're looking at chapter 10 and 11 today. The third period is the scattering of the people. Chapter 10 specifically is that chapter that connects the 2 major events of the flood and getting us into the scattering of the people. The narrative of the scattering is chapter 11, verses 1 through 9. And so as we look at this, this is an interesting way that Moses wrote this to advance the story. We need to realize that Moses wrote, how many of the there's 5 that we call, what is that group of 5 we call at the beginning? The Torah, what's another word for it?
Pentateuch, Law of Moses, Books of Moses.
There's a bunch of different names for it. Super significant stuff. Moses wrote. And so here in the book of Genesis, was he present when he was writing about these events? Is this a first-hand narrative like we might think of with the Gospels or something like that? No. This was many, many years later with inspiration of the Holy Spirit, of course. But we see Moses writing, and so you can see his perspective a little bit in the way that it's written. And so it's important for us to remember that Moses wrote the Pentateuch with the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. And so chapter 10 is not chronological. It is not chronological. But it does set up the events and give more of an explanation about how things went. What is it in the first part of chapter 10 that would make you think that this is not chronological? And I'm using it as in juxtaposition to chapter 11. Why is chapter 10 obviously not chronological with chapter 11? Okay, Ethan said, verse 31, these are the sons of Shem according to their families, according to their tongues, by the lands, according to their nations. Well, in chapter 11, now the whole earth had the same language and the same words. So obviously, those are almost back-to-back verses, almost. And so we can see that it's not in chronological order.
And that's not something just thrown in at the end. It's mentioned 3 times, at least 3
That's right.
times in chapter 10. So that whole chapter is about people that are divided by nations, by languages, according to their family. So
Yeah, verse 5 is the first mentioning of that in chapter 10. So it's mentioned throughout chapter 10 that they had their own tongues, they had their own languages. And so it is not a chronological exposition of the events, but it is a good setting up for what's told in chapter 11. Do want to call your attention to a phrase that is mentioned 4 times here at the end of chapter 9, twice in chapter 10, and once in chapter 11. In chapter 9, in verse 28, it says, "And Noah lived 350 years after the flood." The phrase, "after the flood," it's used 4 times. In each one of these times, God is providing something that allowed the earth to be repopulated, for it to multiply. Noah was given life. Noah was an old man, right? Lived 350 years. We know he was old by our standards for sure. But how long was it that he spent building the ark? 120. So we recognize Noah as an old man, but God gave him life even after the flood. In chapter 10, in verse 1, that phrase shows up again. "Now these are the generations of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, the sons of Noah, and sons were born to them after the flood." We oftentimes take for granted and don't really think about the devastation that the flood did. Everybody was wiped off the face of the earth except Noah and his wife and Shem, Ham, and Japheth and their wives. But God provided not only Noah's sons, but in verse 1, he provided his sons with sons. And we'll get more into those names as we get into chapter 10. All right, so family. If you connect those dots to where I just read a moment ago, connect it to verse 5. "From these coastlands of the nations were separated into their lands, everyone according to his tongue, according to their families, into their nations." The thing that I thought was so cool in my study this last few days on this, whenever you see this phrase, "after the flood," it parallels the promises that are about to be made to Abraham. So from Shem, Ham, and Japheth, God didn't promise it, but he gave them nations. So there's a nation promise. Dropping down to verse 32, "These are the families of the sons of Noah according to their generations, by their nations," specifically their nations. "And out of these, the nations were separated on the earth after the flood." There's the phrase, "after the flood." What else were they given according to verse 32? Kind of have to separate it out. They had to have land to support their people. We have a seed promise. We have land that is provided, which would parallel, it's not promised, but it parallels the promises to come. And then in chapter 11, in verse 10, "These are the generations of Shem. Shem was 100 years old and became the father of Arphaxad 2 years after the flood." What do we know about Shem and his lineage? Christ would come through them. Do we see a parallel here? The promises, the covenants are not made specifically here, but God was, I think it's foreshadowing of what we're about to see with Abraham in chapter 12. And it's all connected with that one phrase, after the flood. So after the destruction of all these things, God provided them life. He provided them offspring. Their families would be nations. He provided the lands to support those nations and families that came from them. And through Shem, we know that all nations would be blessed.
It's easy to talk about the flood as some nice kid story to tell, but something that I think that Luke's trying to emphasize is that was a real event. It was a resetting not only of creation, but of God's relationship with man. It was a new Adam in a sense. And, you know, verse 32 that he just mentioned, the reason it goes through these genealogies, I'm not trying to step on your side here, but all of the nations of the earth came from this family. That's why chapter 10 is important. It wasn't like Noah was preserved and then somehow there was this other group over here that did something. No, all nations of the earth came through Noah. And this is how men spread out across the earth in chapter 11.
I'd also call your attention to verse 5 of chapter 10. It says, from these the coastlands of the nations were separated into their lands, everyone according to his tongue, according to their families, into their nations. And again, this, to me, obviously shows the events of the scattering. Known references were prior to the scattering. Let me back up and say that again. That made no sense. This explains that the events after the scattering, although the known references were prior to the scattering. If we talked about the nation of Israel, would Israel necessarily be present? Or do we recognize who that is because of who he is? And so that's what I'm trying to convey. Or the seed of Abraham. And so that trying to reaffirm that point in chapter 10, that it is referenced and they're using terminology that Moses' contemporaries would have understood in connecting these two. Also in verse 10, the beginning of his kingdom was Babel and Erech and Akkad and Calneh in the land of Shinar. And so, if you remember back one of our questions about listing the characters per time period, this would be the place you would go to figure out that Nimrod would have been the one present there at Babel. But when we look at this chapter, there's a lot of information that is important for us to see. I won't spend some time reading, but I want you to observe some things from the maps as we read. This first map, that if you can see it well enough, if you're all the way in the back, you may struggle. Might help to turn around and look at that one back there. But it lists the names that correlate with the names listed in chapter 10 and their regions. So this is verses 1 through 9 of Genesis 10, and it talks about the Shem, Ham, and Japheth. If you'll notice, see that the bottom left corner, the purple names belong to Shem, the orange names belong to Ham, and the green names belong to Japheth. And so you can, even if you can't read them, you can see the colors. Japheth more to the north. Okay. And then the orange is more in the central and to the west towards Africa. And then you have the purple, which goes around, essentially staying right there on the coastline, where you can see Joktan and down in the corner of the Red Sea there, and to the east, southeast of the Persian Gulf. So we see the dispersing. And so those names are listed that are listed here in Genesis chapter 10. And so back to the point that Andrew was making, these are real people, these are real nations that are verifiable, that are followable in many ways. So when it starts talking about in chapter 2, the sons of Japheth were Gomer and Magog, Madai and Javan and Tubal and Meshach and Tiras, we know approximately where they went and what direction they dispersed. Also, when we go to chapter 6, the sons of Ham, the orange ones, the sons of Ham were Cush and Mizraim and Put and Canaan. The sons of Cush were Seba and Havilah and Sabta and Raama and Sabtika. And the sons of Raama were Sheba and Dedan. And so you can see all these names up here and how they dispersed. Again, with generalities. Now, this next map spends more time as the focus would be in verses 10 through 18. You'll notice verses 1 through 9 focuses on names of people and the family connections. And so that's how the basis of chapter 10 was, of the first map was based off names. When you start in verse 10 going through 18, it lists them out by locations. So in verse 10, it talks about Babylon, Akkad, Erech, in the land of Shinar. And so you can see up in Mesopotamia where they are listed. Which is right here. So Babylon, Shinar, Akkad, Erech is in this area, and that's what's referenced there in verse 10. In verses 11 and 12, you have Nineveh, Rezin, and Calah, which is up here in this northern edge of the Tigris River. So up in this area. So it's listing these places. Verse 13 talks about these names that are down here in Egypt. So you can see those there in verse 13. Verse 14 is the western coast of the Red Sea down in here. Seba, Cush, Pathrusim. So we have that on the east coast of, the west coast of the Red Sea. Verse 15 talks about Canaan and Heth and Sidon. So in this area. Now, it gets more specific in verses 16 through 18 with some names that we would see more in what time period? Where do we see the names in verses 16 through 18? Invasion and conquest. So we're looking more detailed here in Canaan. There's a little inset box. Lists all of those. Archites, and Sinites, Sidonianites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hittites, Hivites, Jebusites, Girgashites. So this is just a blowing up of that area right there, which we know that's where Jerusalem is. That's where we see Galilee, Samaria, and Judea located. So this map, and as the text follows, focuses more on the cities that are there. The verse 19 shows us, it talks about Sidon, Gerar. It also talks about Sodom, Admah, Zeboim, and Laasha. So we have those that are mentioned again there in verse 19. The reason I'm taking the time just to point these out is that these are real places. These are real accounts of historical events and of historical people that did exist. And then, so that map kind of explains verse 19. And then verses 20 through 29 is more of a listing of the sons of Ham. You can see starting there in verse 20 and Shem in verse 22. And we're focusing back to Noah's children, Shem, Ham, and Japheth there. So we see it kind of falls back to those that we've already discussed. And the last ones that are mentioned there in verse 30 are the two places here, Mesha and Sephir, on the east side of the Red Sea. And so we have all of those that are referenced. Chapter 11.
All right, so that all leads us into the Tower of Babel. And you may wonder, why would just these few verses, 9 verses, constitute a full biblical time period? Brother Waldron talks about that a little bit in your book. I'll refer you to that, I guess, for that. But this is a critical moment in the history of mankind. This is how people were dispersed. And I sort of started thinking about it. Why was there one language in the world at the time? Verse 1 says the whole earth used the same language and the same words. Literally, it means they were one lip and used the same words. If you think about it, if one language was there, what need would there be to create another language? Now people have created languages, and the languages that are around today are more recent, probably constructions there. But there was no need, and that caused them really to band together against God's promise. What did he tell them after they got out of the ark? They should do what in chapter 9? All right, they were supposed to spread out. They were supposed to multiply and fill the earth. That was a promise that should have reminded us of a command that should have reminded us about what Adam and Eve were given and their children after them. Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. And yet these people are here using their one language and one tongue. And what do they decide to do? Well, they're all in the same location. Let's just read the first 9 verses here of 11 and go through the story. Now the whole earth used the same language and the same words. It came about as they journeyed east that they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. They said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly." And they used brick for stone, and they used tar for mortar. They said, "Come, let us build for ourselves a city, a tower whose top will reach into heaven. And let us make for ourselves a name. Otherwise, we will be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth." Now, why were they doing this thing? There's a lot of ourselves in this verse, isn't there? The first thing, they want to build ourselves a city. Hey, we need a place to live. We want to have this great city. We want to be known for building this great city. Also, we want to build a tower, not just any tower, but a tower that extends into the heaven. I don't know how tall necessarily some of those buildings were. A lot of them were wiped out by the flood, obviously. This is, I think what I read was about a little over 100 years after the flood when the Tower of Babel was here. During the days of Peleg. Peleg's lifespan was inside of Noah's, so Noah was around. I don't know if he was in Babel. Maybe he was. But he was on the earth at the time, it seems. But they had banded together to make themselves a great name. And it's interesting that what they wanted to avoid, the last phrase there in verse 4, is that, hey, otherwise we're going to be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth. Now, I don't know if the people present there knew that God had commanded Noah and his family to do that afterwards. Regardless, they wanted to avoid that. They wanted to avoid this idea that God had for man to multiply and scatter about the face of the earth. And in order to keep that from happening, they were going to build this great city, this great tower. Verse 5. The Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the sons of men had built. The Lord said, "Behold, they are one people, and they all have the same language. And this is why they began to what they began to do, and now nothing which they purpose to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down there and confuse their language, so that they will not understand one another's speech." So the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of the whole earth, and they stopped building the city. Therefore its name was called Babel, because the Lord confused their language and the whole earth of the whole earth, and from there the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of the whole earth. So because of this event, this city was named Babel. Did anybody look up what Babel meant? Or you probably already know. All right, confusion. Now, I work for a company that has major operations in Colombia, South America. Do you know how difficult it is to get work done when the other person speaks exclusively Spanish? Impossible. Not like we're kind of going to get some stuff done. There's going to need, when we find somebody that can speak both Spanish and English, we've got something. But if we can't understand one another, at my work, we can't get anything done. And you imagine these people that are trying to build this probably very advanced project during that time. How would that work when you're working next to somebody and all of a sudden you have no clue what they're saying? What's that? Women are to keep silent, Siri. All right. There we go. So this major project now has this major problem of the workers can't understand one another. No longer are they going to build this city for themselves or build this tower for themselves. The communication is going to be a major problem. And what chapter 10 taught us was these languages were not just haphazardly thrown on random people. They were separated by families and by nations. And so while there certainly were kinfolk that probably spoke different languages, they were separated into family groups. I mean, all of these people are cousins to some degree, because we're only talking about 100, 120 years after the flood. All right, so God's instruction, no, we've already talked about that. Their purposes, we've talked about that. You can go to the next slide, I think. All right, so what happened from this? Nations were created. One thing I did want to bring out in chapter 11, I'm not sure if this is significant, but it did jump out to me. When the people decided that they were going to go about this project and to build this city, it started out with 3 words: come, let us. Come, let us. So, hey, let's get together. Let's do this thing that, whether we acutely recognize it or not in the moment, is against God's will. He wants us to scatter. It said that nothing that they purpose in their heart will be impossible for them. I don't think that's a threat to God's power and ability. It wasn't that he thought if they stayed together that they were going to somehow overthrow his power or be a threat to who God was. It was, if they do band together and stay together, what are they going to use? It wasn't a judgment on the unity that might be there, but I think it probably was a judgment on what they would do with the unity. What were they doing with the unity here? They wanted to build a city for themselves. They wanted to make their name known. They did not want to be scattered. And so while the unity part probably is admirable, they were not using it for God's purpose. All right, so when Crawford?
One is the people's usage of like, come let us, where God says that in creation. So it's not man's job to assume God's position. And then, and then the symbolism with Babel being Babylon. I mean, that was the same word there, and thinking about that with regard to the rest of the Bible.
Yeah, so Babel and Babylon are the exact same Hebrew word as I understand it. I'm no Hebrew expert, but that's what I gathered from some of the study I did. All right, but what are the first 3 words that God uses when he decides to act against the people? He says, come, let us. I don't know if I'm reading into this too much, but whatever we purpose and whatever we decide to do with our lives, if it's not for God, it can easily be thwarted by his ability and power. These people got together and decided they were going to do this very great thing, a great city, a great tower. We are going to establish ourselves on the earth. And God, in a moment, thwarted all of those plans. And it wasn't like he knocked them off the stool and they had to get back up. No, it stopped. It halted progress there. Jewish tradition says that Nimrod was actually the one that kind of got that together. The Bible doesn't tell us that. I won't say that that's sure or not. He did establish his kingdom there. Scripture does tell us that. So he probably played some role in that, and we'll talk about Nimrod in a second. Lauren, you got something?
My personal opinion is that it's the people divided. My thought is the division of the continents would have happened with the flood. That's my inclination. But again, I have no scripture to back that up. That's Luke's 2 cents worth.
Yeah, it's pretty generally accepted that Peleg, that reference to Peleg was when this confusion happened. Which would make sense because it references the language in chapter 10, even though it's prior to chapter 11. So we might ask ourselves, what happened to good old Nimrod? Well, in chapter 10, verse 10, it explains in pretty good detail. Nimrod was a city builder, but he was more than a city builder. He became a strong ruler, if you will. Verse 10 says, the beginning, talking about Nimrod, the beginning of his kingdom was Babel and Erech, which Iraq was named after, by the way, and Akkad and Calneh in the land of Shinar. From that land he went forth into Assyria and built Nineveh and Rehoboth-ir and Calah and Rezin between Nineveh and Calah. This is the great city. So Nimrod was pretty ambitious. Even after this confusion, which meant that he was now separated from some other people and now had his family, he went about and made some of these cities, took over some of these cities for whatever reason. And the extra biblical accounts in history give us some very interesting information about Nimrod. One thing that it tells us is that he set up his throne in Babel. If you were going to build a great city to make yourself a great name and this great tower that would reach up to heaven, and God, I can't imagine that the people there thought that that was just some random chance. They had to know that that was God's hand in it, and we probably shouldn't build what we're building. Just a guess there. But he set up his throne in that location, which to me, man, I'd want to get as far away from there as I can probably. But nonetheless, he set up his throne in Babel. He became this, had this reputation of being a God-like figure. And he was worshipped by his descendants, by his grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and however long he went. And he was known as Belus there. Belus is a word that means chief or ruler or king or something like that. But that name for him took on something extra, it seemed. This is some of the information. This is from Answers in Genesis about some of the extra biblical accounts that I thought was interesting, and I did not make the connection between this and some of the future biblical accounts. So I'm going to read that. The Georgian account, as well as another account called Armenian Chronicle, tells us that Nimrod reigned 126 years until he was killed in battle fighting against the Armenians. Specifically, it's recorded that he was killed by the son of Togarmah named Haik. Togarmah was the son of Gomer, the son of Japheth, the son of Noah. Although some of these historical accounts mix up certain details about peoples after Babel, which is expected from fallible history, we can generally follow who they are discussing. Even so, Belus Nimrod expanded his kingdom far and wide until his death. That's how far his kingdom reached, the red section there on the map at its height. Note, Belus is a title like chief, lord, or king. From Nimrod's line, Noah, Ham, and Cush all had the title of Belus. In John Gill's commentary, he notes an early Christian historian, Eusebius, and says, the Babylonians say that the first was Belus, called Cronus or Saturn, that is Noah, and of him was begotten another Belus, and Cham, and he begat Cham, the father of the Phoenicians, and him another son. Chus was begotten, whom the Greeks call Asbolus, the father of the Ethiopians, the brother of Misraim, the father of the Egyptians. After Nimrod established himself as king and began conquering the surrounding lands, he was sadly elevated to godlike status by his descendants, worshipped simply as Belus or Baal. That Baal, B-A-A-L. He was also known as Marduk or Merodach, which is equated with Baal in Jeremiah 50:20. The Assyrians specifically tie Baal, the god that they worshipped, back to Nimrod. Other cultures, it's not as clear, but there is a connection specifically with the Assyrians. After the language splitting at Babel, many patriarchs who were listed at Babel came out with multiple names due to the multiple languages. One variation of Nimrod was Ninus, which is where the name Nineveh came from. Nineveh and Nimrud, also called Calah, were early cities with names derived from Nimrod's various names. Ninus' description given by ancient historians Diodorus Siculus and Justin matched Nimrod rather well. After Nimrod's death, his kingdom fell apart into petty kingdoms in certain local areas. Eusebius relates the event closer to home, stating that Queen Semiramis, which some suggest was the wife of Nimrod, retained power, reigning for 42 years in Assyria, and was known for building projects in Babylon. Many of the local rulers vied for power in Nimrod's broken kingdom, controlling bits and pieces of it. Sometime in the aftermath of Nimrod's death, and possibly Semiramis' death, a war broke out between the two groups of vying kings and is mentioned in Genesis 14, 1 through 9. What happened in Genesis 14, 1 through 9? Do you remember? All right. The 5 kings kidnapped Lot, and who had to go save Lot?
Abram.
Abraham and his army. And here's the account. This is talking about those local rulers, it seemed, in Nimrod's kingdom. This is from Genesis 14, 1 through 9. And it came to pass in the days of Amraphel, king of Shinar, Arioch, king of Elisar, Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, and Tidal, king of nations, that they made war with Barak, king of Sodom, Bersha, king of Gomorrah, Shinab, king of Admah, Shemember, king of Zeboam, the king of Bela, that is Zoar. All these joined together in the valley of Siddim. 12 years they served Chedorlaomer, and in the 13th year they rebelled. In the 14th year Chedorlaomer and the kings that were with him came and attacked the Rephaim, and in Ashtaroth Kirnaim, the Zunim in Ham, the Emim in Shaveh Kiriathim, and the Horites in the mountain of Seir, as far as El Paran, which is by the wilderness. Then they turned back and came to En Mishpat, that is Kadesh, and attacked all the country of the Amalekites and all the Amorites who dwelt in Hazazon Tamar, and the king of Sodom, the king of Gomorrah, the king of Admah, the king of Zeboim, the king of Bela, that is Zoar, went out and joined together in battle in the valley of Siddim against Chedorlaomer, king of Edom, Tidal, king of nations, Amraphel, king of Shinar, and Arioch, king of Elisar, 4 kings against 5. So a lot of these stories that we hear about, kings from here and kings from there, we don't always get the exact backstory, but some of these extra big biblical accounts give us some information about where these kings came from. And it seems to be from Nimrod's line that these came for. But Abraham was dragged into this fight, and he successfully rescued his nephew. By this point, the smaller kingdoms were created out of that great empire, and we got nations like the Akkadian Empire, the Assyrian Empire, Egypt, and places like that. So, I don't know. Those are things that I did not know before this study, that there seems to be a connection there, and it's amazing that it happens right there in Genesis 14. Of course, Melchizedek is directly after that, and so there's a lot to the story that Scripture doesn't necessarily tell us, but there are hints of it that we can find out and use to get some more information about them.
All right, so before we completely shut it off, as we finish chapter 11, I think you can see that there were a lot more people on the earth than just Abraham and his family. Each one of these names represents a people and a language. But what we're about to do in chapter 11 is to focus in on this area right here, because this is where Ur the Chaldees are, and that's where Abraham is when God calls him. So from chapter 11 to chapter 12, the Bible focuses way down. We're not going to talk about Put, Ludum, and all these people over here. We don't talk about Tarshish until Jonah. That's about the only other time that's even mentioned. But we're going to focus in to talk about Abraham and his seed as we go into the patriarchs. Mr. Dennis? To walk across them because it was so great and so large. And so we're really focusing in now that we've got the people scattered, and we're not talking about everybody anymore. The chapter 11 is the last account about one great people in all the earth. Now we're focusing on one great family as we see their storyline. Now, it's been easy to read the sections of Scripture for each time period so far. Chapter 12 through 50 by Sunday is going to be a little bit more of a chew. At least review it and flip through and read your headings so that we're able to talk about the patriarchs. It's going to be easier to teach in some ways and harder in others.